The fire roared like a living beast, spitting sparks into the evening sky as the sun dipped behind the hills of rural Montana. The wind pushed thick smoke across the quiet highway, turning everything into a blur of orange and black. And in the middle of it all, a battered SUV lay tilted in a ditch, flames curling around its undercarriage, windows shattered, metal groaning. Inside, two tiny girls pressed their palms against the glass, crying in fear. Their stuffed bear sat between them, already smeared with ash. They were trapped, helpless, fading behind the smoke. And running toward them, covered in dust, panting, his hands still greasy from the day's work, was Ethan Ryder, a lone mechanic who had simply chosen the wrong time to drive home, or perhaps the right time, depending on how fate chose to write the story that followed. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, and that second chances can come from the unlikeliest of places, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stories like this one are meant to remind us what humanity is still capable of. Ethan wasn't a man who looked for trouble, nor was he someone who invited recognition. Life had carved him into a quiet, rugged figure who kept his head down and his heart guarded. He lived alone on a rundown farm on the outskirts of Birchwood County, tending to a few cattle, fixing tractors, and helping neighbors when they needed him. People knew him, but nobody really knew him. And that was fine with him. He had already lost too much, a marriage that crumbled after the death of his newborn son, a dream of fatherhood that died in a sterile hospital room, and the hope of rebuilding his life that seemed to fade with every passing year. But as he sprinted toward the burning SUV, none of that mattered. Someone needed help. Someone needed him. The flames cracked louder, swallowing the rear of the car as if hunger drove them. The young mother inside, bruised and terrified, struggled to push her weight against the jammed door. Her wide blue eyes were swollen with panic, her blonde hair stiff with dust and blood. When Ethan reached the door, he could feel the heat burn through his shirt. The metal was almost too hot to touch. But the sound of the girls crying, high, sharp, desperate, pushed everything else away. Ethan wrapped his hands around the handle and pulled. It didn't budge. He planted his boots in the dirt, muscles straining, breath gritting through his teeth. The fire behind them gave a deafening crack as the gas tank from the overturned vehicle beside the SUV exploded, sending a wave of heat sweeping over him. The mother screamed. The twins cried louder. Ethan pulled harder, feeling the skin on his palms sear. Metal gave way. The door snapped open, slamming backward, and Ethan reached inside, grabbing the mother's arm and hauling her out with a strength powered by sheer adrenaline. She stumbled forward, coughing and gasping. But before she could stand, she looked back, panic twisting her voice as she pointed to the rear seat. Her daughters. The smoke was thick now, rolling like a dark ocean inside the vehicle. Ethan didn't waste a second. He dove back into the burning SUV, crawling across shattered glass as flames licked at the roof. He could barely see them, two trembling shapes in pink dresses, clutching each other. He reached out and scooped them into his arms, one under each shoulder, their tears soaking into his shirt. They were shaking uncontrollably, their little hands gripping him with a strength only pure terror could create. As he backed out of the SUV with the twins in his arms, the fire within finally breached the cabin. Heat erupted behind him, a guttural roar chasing him out into the open. He shielded the girls with his body, pressing their faces into his chest, and sprinted as far as he could before collapsing into the grass, coughing from the smoke. The mother threw herself onto her daughters, sobbing uncontrollably, checking their tiny faces as if she still couldn't believe they were alive. Ethan lay back on the dirt, staring up at the twilight sky as the fire blazed behind him. It was over. They were safe. And for the first time in years, as he listened to the twins cry while clinging to their mother, Ethan felt something shift inside him, something warm, something painful, something familiar. Something like purpose. The paramedics who arrived later praised his bravery. The mother, whose name he learned was Grace Whitmore, held onto his arm and thanked him repeatedly, tears still slipping down her soot-stained cheeks. But as soon as he knew they were all right, Ethan stepped away quietly, brushing off attention like dust from his shirt. He wasn't a hero. At least, he didn't think so. He was just a mechanic who happened to be nearby. But what Ethan didn't know was that Grace Whitmore wasn't just any mother. And the events of that evening, his instinctive bravery, his willingness to risk his life for complete strangers, were about to pull him out of anonymity in a way he could never have imagined. That night Ethan returned to his lonely farm, his hands wrapped in bandages from burns and cuts, his body exhausted. But the quiet felt heavier than usual. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those girls' little hands pressed against the window, their terrified faces blurred by smoke. He saw the mother's desperate eyes, the flames just seconds away from taking everything. It replayed again and again, until sleep finally came. But sleep didn't last long. At dawn, the ground beneath his farmhouse began to tremble softly, followed by a distant thumping that grew louder and louder. Ethan sat up, confused. He walked to the porch, rubbing his eyes, and froze. The sky above his fields was filled with helicopters. Not one. Not two. More than a dozen. They circled like metallic birds, their blades chopping through the morning air. Dust from his field spiraled upward in thick clouds as two of them descended toward his pasture. Ethan's heart pounded, bewildered. He shielded his eyes as the wind from the rotors whipped across him, scattering hay and dirt. And then, through the haze, he saw a group of people stepping out onto his land. Suits. Cameras. Emergency responders. And Grace Whitmore herself, cradling her daughters, both of whom were looking around with wide eyes. The scene didn't make sense, not to someone like Ethan, who expected nothing from the world. But before he could voice his confusion, another helicopter door opened, and out stepped Governor Charles Whitmore, Grace's father. Ethan felt his breath catch. It hit him like a punch. Grace wasn't just a mother. She was the daughter of one of the most influential political figures in the entire state. And the little girls he carried out of the fire weren't just twins, they were the governor's granddaughters. He had saved a family whose protection was a matter of national priority. As the dust settled, the governor's security team raced ahead, forming a perimeter. A dozen news crews stepped out, cameras already rolling, capturing the rare, dramatic scene unfolding on a modest farm tucked in the middle of nowhere. Ethan stood frozen, deeply overwhelmed, desperately wishing for a hole to crawl into. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't someone built for cameras, microphones, or attention. But the governor walked right toward him, his weathered face carved with emotion Ethan almost didn't believe was real. The moment Governor Whitmore reached him, he took Ethan's hand in both of his and squeezed tightly. The older man's eyes glistened with the kind of gratitude that words didn't seem capable of expressing. Behind him, Grace stood holding her daughters, both little girls smiling shyly at Ethan in a way that made his chest feel strangely warm. News reporters stepped forward, microphones aimed, capturing every second. But the governor shook his head, silencing them. He turned back to Ethan and spoke in a low, almost trembling voice that only those near them could hear. He told Ethan that he had not only saved lives, he had saved an entire family from heartbreak beyond repair. That his bravery had rewoven hope into their world. He said he had spent the whole night replaying the moment he received the call about his daughter's accident, imagining the horror of what could have happened if Ethan hadn't been there, reminding him of how precious, and fragile, life could be. Ethan didn't know how to respond. He felt out of place, humbled, almost embarrassed by the attention. But before he could retreat, Grace stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. It startled him, this fragile woman holding on as if he were the only reason her world still stood. She whispered her gratitude, soft and trembling against his shoulder. Her twins, still clinging to her dress, looked up at Ethan with bright curiosity, their fear replaced by innocence. The governor didn't come empty-handed. He announced, on live television, that his family owed Ethan a debt that could never be repaid. But they would try. He revealed plans for a full-scale